next session during this conference. My name is Andreas Johansson-Heinö. I'm Director of Publishing at the liberal think tank Timbro here in Stockholm. For the next 75 minutes, we will have a discussion here on the issue of Europe after Brexit. Disintegration, stronger cooperation, maybe both, maybe none of them. We have three prominent speakers here who will share the stage with me and give their different perspectives on this issue. We will have first Håkan Jonsson, who will speak on the Brexit dimension and what the implications and what to expect of Brexit in the next few years. We have Karin Svanborg-Sjövall, who will give the small state, the Swedish perspective, and we have Anke, who will give the German perspective. And I will give you each 10 minutes for introductions, and then we'll have a discussion on the stage, and then we'll open the floor for you to participate as well. But first, Håkan Jonsson. Håkan is Director of Public Affairs at Johansson-Heinö. You have a long background as a diplomat, as Secretary of State with responsibility for EU issues in the former government, as Deputy Director of the National Board of Trade, among other things, I would say. And now you're here to give us your view on the complicated procedure of Brexit. So please, very welcome.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm just clicking on this. Yes. So the title is Europe After Brexit, Disintegration or Stronger Cooperation. And I will give you a dramatic answer on the Brexit dimension and a boring answer on the disintegration or stronger cooperation dimension. My two key points is I will go into the timetable and possible end result on Brexit, and I will be, as I said, a little bit dramatic because my take on this is that we might end up in 8 to 10 years and Brexit not happening. 5 to 10 years, back to square one. And then on Europe long term, my point will be neither of the two, but rather this typical EU muddling through scenario that I'm always fond of. If you look at Brexit, there are several procedures that will be carried out in parallel. The most obvious one, and the one that everyone is talking about, is the Article 50 in the Treaty on the European Union, the old Maastricht Treaty that is now living on in its new post-Lisbon shape. It's on how to leave. There is this very famous maximum of 2 years, and this can be prolonged, but only by unanimity, which means the UK will be very much in trouble every time a prolongation is on the table. And everyone who has ever negotiated a deal where there are QMV for most of the decision, but suddenly there is one unanimity that pops in, know that everyone will connect. If the Brits are in the situation of having to prolong, all the other have the veto card, and they will use that veto card also for other things in the negotiations. There is the Article 218 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the old Rome Treaty. And that is the way in which the European Union negotiates trade agreements and cooperation agreements with neighboring countries and other third parties. And that is how the procedure will be done if and when the Brits want a soft Brexit and a Brexit that is followed by a replacement cooperation treaty. And then there is the foreign trade agreements promised by the Leave campaign with third countries. And then there is the UK's own screening of the acquis communautaire. We'll come back to that. And of course, in play with this is the hard Brexit option that Mrs. May, the Prime Minister, played with in her party conference speech, and the markets reacted very sharply, and you all know what happened. The question put to the House of Lords in a report last summer where they asked if the Article 50 is a reversible process. If you change your mind in the middle, can you revoke it? And the answer by the lawyers was overwhelmingly, yes, you can. And then, of course, there's the Scotland and Northern Ireland issue, which we will not look into here. But I will look most into the third part of this, the fourth part, where how will Britain treat the acquis communautaire after a Brexit? What will happen to the 10,000 legislative acts that are there as the secondary law of the EU, and what shape will it take in Britain afterwards? And this is from the conference party speech on 2nd of October. And Mrs. May said, as we repeal the European Communities Act, we will convert the acquis. When the Great Repeal Bill is given royal assent, Parliament will be free to amend, repeal, and improve any law it chooses. But by converting the acquis into British law, we will give business and workers maximum certainty as we leave the EU, and the same rules will apply. Any changes of the law will have to be subject to the full scrutiny and proper parliamentary debate. And she went on to say, but we will seek the best deal possible. I want to involve free trade in goods and services. I want it to give British companies maximum freedom to trade with and operate in the single market. And she says also, we are not leaving the European Union only to give up control of immigration again, and we are not leaving only to return to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Further on, we are going to have the freedom to make our own decisions on a whole host of different matters, from how we label our food to the way in which we choose to control immigration. And when she says this, to use the labeling of food as an example, that is pure internal market, it's core internal market, it's the freedom of free movement of goods. And when she said that they would be free of the European Court of Justice here, those words carry meaning. And a question I will put, is this at all possible? Is what she is looking for even feasible? There's a political problem here. If, let's say that all of these 10,000 legal acts are kept, as she says, and then gradually changed, only bits and pieces at a time, only this law this time, and next year this law, and you disregard of the Court of Justice in Luxembourg because you feel free of this. What does this mean for the internal market? It means you are leaving bit by bit the internal market. On every piece of legislation you change, you can no longer do business with Europe automatically, which is the essence of the internal market. And on every piece of legislation, whether it's a new court case from the European Court in Luxembourg, and you choose not to follow it, you are in fact, de facto, legally speaking, leaving the internal market on that point. On the other hand, the idea of doing this will be to dramatically, and we see this quote from David Davis from the summer, which is very much a resonance what they said in the Leave campaign. Regulation already in place will stay for the moment, but a flood of new regulation from Europe will be halted. We can then look at structuring our regulatory environment so that it helps business rather than hinders. We should look to match regulation for companies to their primary export market, and we can significantly improve our growth rate by stopping the flood of unnecessary market and product regulation. We can significantly improve our growth rate. We're happier outside because we can have light touch regulation. We can tailor-make the laws on products and everything else so that it fits Britain and the big export markets that are not the European Union. This means to me that he has promised to change a number of laws, quite substantial number of laws, so that this actually happens. I mean, if you only change 5 of 10,000 laws, can you really say that you have significantly improved the growth rate by stopping the flood of unnecessary market regulation? No, you can't. I also wanted to add something you said about the free trade agreements with third countries. We can do them quickly. I would expect the new Prime Minister on September 9th to immediately trigger a larger round of global trade deals with all of our most favored trade partners, etc. And you will know this has not happened. And he's also said they can be concluded between 12 and 24 months. And I look at a lot of faces here who have been doing trade agreements in the past, and you can see the feasibility of that. So the political problem is you are not delivering on the pledge by the Leave campaign to significantly improve the business climate in Britain if you only change a very little part of these 10,000 laws. And the legal problem is when you start changing the laws in Britain or not following the updates from Brussels or Strasbourg or the court cases from Luxembourg, you are de facto leaving bits and piece by piece the internal market. The key is constantly moving in Brussels, Strasbourg, and Luxembourg, and you have the comitology application rules, etc. So whatever happens here, bit by bit, England is leaving the internal market. So the two pledges, they are not compatible, and I would even say that neither of them is really feasible. And the automatic recognition, that is the very point, the very essence of the internal market, now it's lost. And what will this lead to? All the products in a container going from Britain to the continent will now have to be checked. It means border controls. It means lost legal certainty for companies. And also, I would say this makes almost impossible the customs union and the common border to the third countries. On the timetable side, a possible timetable of all this. Step one, we already know, the There is a court decision that this has to be a parliamentary decision before you invoke Article 50. We'll see if it's upheld. It's been challenged. But no, if it would be upheld, the biggest effect I would say of this is that not only does Mrs. May have to go through Parliament with a formal decision, but also the Parliament in that situation, I would assume, will wish to have a say not only on putting her finger on the trigger, but also what is the strategy. A combination of what is the process we are setting in motion and what is the strategy for the end result. There is a parliamentary logic that says that 70% of the members of Parliament are against Brexit, but I would say that the party political logic will override in this case, and it would be suicide by, in particular, the Conservatives, but to some extent also Labour, not to follow the popular vote of the referendum. That would mean, in effect, giving away their votes to the UKIP. Step 2, the handling of Article 50. The handing in of it, sorry. Theresa May says that this would be before the end of March. There's a 2-year deadline, and I mentioned it before. I think it's quite likely it has to be prolonged. Step 3, that there will be no... I mean, the Article 50 negotiations are quite straightforward. That's about striking the UK name and recalculating the votes in Council and Parliament. Tricky business, but it can be done in 2 years. But the replacement under Article 218, a sui generis deal, not a Norwegian model, not a Swiss model, not a Canadian model. Mrs. May have ruled them all out, and I think she's wise in doing that. A sui generis deal will take much more than 2 years to negotiate, I'm quite sure. This means that either you accept the 2-year deadline and you're thrown out in the cold water with no replacement deal, the hard Brexit, and you know the markets reacted to that, or you ask for a prolongation, and you will find yourself in this situation that I mentioned before, where you will have a unanimity for prolongation and then a lot of other things on the table at the same time. My conclusion, that is very unlikely that they will manage within 2 years. With one set of prolongation, you will be in 4 years of negotiations, and that, in my mind, is the minimum it will take to negotiate this. And then the last step is, what will the end result look like? And my point is that the end result will be nowhere near what the Leave campaign pledged in the referendum campaign. So the end of the affair, to quote Graham Greene, when, my estimate is 5 to 7 years' time from now, what an outcome that cannot secure access to the internal market, and at the same time cannot secure UK independence fully from Brussels and the EU courts. At least those are incompatible with each other, and you will have no deals with third countries prepared in this time frame, etc. So there's a crisis of legitimacy and feasibility of this, and then it's up to decide whether you want to push through this bad deal, or have a parliamentary rebellion against it, or have a second referendum, because it will be a new situation, and it will be a new electorate, in fact. In short, we're back to square one, and Europe will have been navel-gazing for 10 years at this time when we're supposed to do many other things. It's dangerous times, as we just mentioned, and now I only have 30 seconds or something for my second point.
45.
Okay, thank you. How the EU usually acts in severe crisis is muddling through. No dramatic push forward. We have seen voices saying that now is the time to, without the UK, to do dramatic changes and big moves ahead. Both the Folkpartiet leader, the Liberalerna leader, and Mr. Gunnar Lund, the retired ambassador, have been pushing forward that agenda. Others have been saying we should listen to the signal that Brexit gives us and be more careful and have a few steps back in integration. And I think neither of those two scenarios is really what's going to happen. I think it's going to be muddling through as usual. Then there's the question of a risk of spread of Brexit. There is a political risk, but I'm not sure there's fertile ground, because the UK is a special case. The media landscape and the different historic experience between the UK and the continent, I think, comes into play here. In the continent, the World War II experience was that nationalism gone bad is a dangerous thing that created Hitler and Mussolini. In Britain, the feeling after the Second World War is that nationalism saved us. The coming together as a country under the strong leadership of a figure like Winston Churchill helped us to survive and helped us defeat the bad influence of the continent. So the view on nationalism is dramatically different. Nationalism, if you ask a German or a Frenchman, needs to be controlled. Nationalism, if you ask a Brit, is still a force of good, more or less. So, and meanwhile in the European Parliament, this is a picture of next week's session, and you can see 10 to 12 different legal acts being negotiated. This is the machine room, not the control command bridge of the vessel. So, in my view, this is the symbol, the very epitome of muddling through. This is what happens when we all look at the big leaders' actions and the machinery continues working. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Håkan. Just one question. Did your analysis, both on the outcome of the eventual, the end of the Brexit, and of your analysis of the prospects of the spreading of it, did it change in any way in the early hours of November 9th?
In a sense, yes. I think you could see the Brexit and the Colombian referendum and Donald Trump's win in America as children of the same father, so to say, the same sign of the times. And I would be fearful of a spread if all those three were root causes and something that was caused by those could happen in Sweden. But if you're instead seeing Donald Trump, Brexit, and the Colombia referendum as symptoms, and the root cause is the big shift that's going on in the Western world, then it's not Brexit spreading to Sweden, it's the same father, the same sign of the times happening here as well. So yes, I'm very much afraid of a populist surge right now in the Western world, also in Sweden, but it's not because of Brexit. Brexit and a possible surge in Sweden are symptoms, and the root cause is deeper and more dangerous than that.
Thank you. Now, Karin Svanborg-Sjövall, President of Timbro, has a background in the European Parliament and in the Swedish government, working also on, at least in the European Parliament, on EU issues as well, and in written reports, lots of articles on this topic as well.
Thank you. I think I'm going to be both a bit more political and perhaps a bit more dramatic than Håkan, although I'd like to start by saying that I do, of course, sort of join in the conclusion that I don't think that European collaboration is about to collapse anytime soon, and we're obviously not there. And thank God for that, because if there was any time that proponents of globalization and free trade and open societies were to act together, it's obviously now. But that said, I do think that there is great cause for concern, and I would disagree on the point that it's going to be business as usual in the same sort of muddling through way that we've known from before. First of all, because there is a history within the European Union that when there is a crisis, there is also a push for integration. We've seen this sort of as a pattern. And the other part is that if you look into the new social agenda that the Commission is proposing, I think that's a pretty radical deal, actually, and a very dangerous path at that. And I think this is a shame, because for all the horror this year, I do think that Brexit, if we do care to learn from the lessons that we've gotten from this year, this could propel us into a better collaboration than the one that we had in the past, one that could help make EU a big part of the solution rather than one of many problems that needs to be fixed. So in these 10 minutes, I will focus on what I think are the main lessons to be learned and where I think the political focus should be right now. First of all, as we listened to the ambassador say a bit earlier, that don't be a victim, I think that's a very wise thing to say. If you listen to our current government right now, there is, I would say, a big lack of enthusiasm for leadership that worries me. Because just because we've lost the natural leader in the Northern Coalition, it doesn't mean that this coalition is less necessary or that we couldn't actually advance it. I do think that the small member states, not least in the North, have a vital part to play in the future of Europe, and one that we should take. That said, this coalition is obviously a lot weaker after the UK left. as long as we had a liberal reformist UK, but also a liberal reformist Poland, we could count, as smaller states, on there being sound guarantees that the project wouldn't veer too far in a federalist direction, without losing the sense that European integration was actually a cause for common good. Now, both of these big allies have shifted in a very different direction, and we see similar tendencies in Holland, we see them in Denmark, we see them in Finland, and to make matters even worse, relations with other allies in the Baltic states have also turned sour due to the refugee crisis. So in that way, the coalition is weaker than it has ever been before. But the European club is still no more than what its members want it to be. And we do punch above our weight. I dare say that it was right for Carl Bildt to sport a big dog attitude, despite the smallness of our population. We cannot compete with Germany, but then again, we never have, and that's really not the point. My idea is rather that the Northern Coalition is necessary and should be advanced because it does form a necessary defense line around the idea that the single market is really the nucleus of this cooperation, the very core. And it is important also because it really highlights the importance of a political balance, both in terms of how we value subsidiarity and a light touch regulatory regime that can tilt if we pull back at this point. We cannot change the outcome of the referendum, but we can do our part. And I dare say, again, that it is more important than ever. This could be a time for advancing our interest if we care to, and we should not waste it. On the other hand, action then presupposes that there is an agenda, and that I think is really what I'm calling out for. And also, probably the point where I will start getting controversial. Today, we have come to a point where not even the four freedoms can be considered holy within this cooperation. It has been a remarkable year. And I think one of the major lessons that we need to take back from the British referendum is that the freedom of movement in particular is one that will be revisited. And the question is how it will be revisited. Not because it's lost its importance or meaning, but just because it's fairly obvious that it needs to be redefined if it is to be saved. And I think, ironically, this is something that David Cameron actually got more right than wrong. Brexit was the beginning of what I think will be a long debate on the European social contract. What rights we are willing to grant citizens from other member states in order to ensure circular migration. You could perhaps look at this as sort of a catch-up effect taking place in the debate, where people are beginning to realize that rights to social benefits have been expanded, sometimes by clear political will, but sometimes also through rulings by the European Court of Justice that haven't been debated properly. We can do very little to stop the atrocities happening in Syria, and while allowing free trade does help poorer countries feed their young, it won't in the short term stop people from trying to get away from dysfunctional institutions and greedy politicians. But we should, I think, be able to come up with a solution that does enable greater flexibility for the member states in Europe to deal with intra-European migration. I think this is core if the cooperation is to survive. If this fails, populists will have many more victories to win. Now, in my view, the Commission is doing the very opposite than what it should be doing. I think it's reacting to this crisis in a very bad way, because while the Brits were fuming over the symbolic issue of child subsidies being sent to other countries, the Commission is launching the new push with a new social agenda, expanding competences where I think it should be backpedaling, recognizing that popular discontent is clearly tied to issues directly related to the sovereignty of the welfare state. Not any state, but the welfare state. In any normal circumstances, I would say that this issue of child benefits were blown absolutely out of proportion. But we don't live in normal circumstances, and I don't think we will for a very long time. So the only way for the EU to regain legitimacy at this point is to ensure that it works. And a continued development towards supranationalism on the area of welfare, I think, will challenge and possibly break this cooperation, including the 4 freedoms that most of us agree are central to retain. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin. Do you agree? I feel that you disagree a bit on the Remain option, and your regret that Cameron did not succeed in that aspect. But do you also disagree with Håkan on his view on what will happen next on the Brexit option?
No, I think your view on the fact that the process of actually leaving will stall, and perhaps stall incessantly, I think is a viable option, though I don't even dare to think about the political consequences of an actual Brexit not taking place. But the legal tangles are obviously very hard to get out of. And I do think that something that you didn't touch on very much, but which was the issue of Ireland and Scotland and independence might be a game changer that actually may shift public opinion also in a way that will stop this from happening.
Great. We'll get back to that in a moment. But first now, let me introduce our final speaker, who is Anke Schmidt-Felzmann, who is a researcher at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. You defended your thesis at the University of Glasgow.
I did indeed.
And your main research is concerned with the EU's performance as an international actor in bilateral relations, in particular energy policy, trade policy, human rights policy towards Russia. Is that correct?
Yes, you've done your homework.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction.
About the German perspective.
I will. I will also dig a little bit deeper into some of the problems that I think we are facing when we're talking about the challenges to European integration, or as it was called, the disintegration or stronger cooperation Europe after Brexit. Because I think there are a number of issues we mustn't forget when we talk about disintegration or stronger cooperation in Europe. Because when we're talking about Europe, it's not just, of course, the European Union. We also have NATO. We have, in this particular region, the Nordic-Baltic cooperation, the Baltic Sea region, Northern Europe more as a concept, and the different regional formations. And I think what is different was addressed in particular by the ambassador earlier this morning, which is that we now have a different motivation for addressing some of the underlying issues that I think we need to think more systematically about. And that is the leverage of outside actors in our societies, which has highlighted in particular the issue of the robustness of the state on the one hand and the resilience of societies. And I think that is really the crux of the matter of what we're talking about, and it also comes back to the issues that you already highlighted and that were already highlighted in with regard to the transatlantic relationship, which is that we really have now a number of security challenges that provide greater motivations to address these issues that are facing our societies and state institutions and the democratic systems, more broadly speaking. But I would argue that one of the fundamental issues that we mustn't forget is that these are parallel, albeit intertwined, but parallel processes. So we have parallel political processes at the national level, and the feedback loop, or the lack of it, between the local level and the national level, and then the national level and the European Union level. And I think there we really are facing some problems when we're discussing European Union integration or European cooperation, more broadly speaking. Because in many ways, the responsibility of handling a lot of the problems rests at the national level with the national governments. Now, the national governments, of course, interact at the European Union level, and also within NATO, within the OSCE, within the Council of the Baltic Sea States, which also still exists and perhaps also has to be highlighted a lot more often, the Council of Europe. But it is, I think the developments that have been going on for at least the last 25 years between the local and the national level on the one hand, and then between the member states and the international organizations, institutions on the other hand, that are the problems that we're facing right now. And while in 2007, 2008, when the financial crisis was starting to show its effects in Europe, the concerns were much more about the societal problems that should be handled at the European Union level, perhaps through greater integration, and where the focus was on the problems of the European Union institutions, of perhaps not having sufficient powers, or perhaps having too many powers in different areas. Right now, we have a different situation, where we actually have to think about what has happened with the integration within the societies and between the local level and the national level, whether that feedback loop is actually functioning sufficiently well. And I would argue that that is the fundamental problem that connects the whole of the transatlantic community, that that feedback loop has not worked so well, that it has only been a one-way street, perhaps, between the national governments and the local level and the different parts of societies. Because when we're looking at the integration at the European Union level and the disaffection in the United Kingdom and the disaffection also in Germany, in the Netherlands, with the referendum that we also shouldn't forget against the association agreement or the DCFTA with Ukraine, and also the current developments in many, if not all, EU member states. They all come back to the well-being of societies across different societal groups and the robustness of the national institutions facing those local developments while we're focusing actually the external threats. Now the trouble is that these developments are not completely interconnected because those processes at the national level have been going on for a long time. But the motivation or the necessity for addressing them has perhaps not been as great as it is today, where the threat from outside is actually sharpening the focus on exactly those issues that have been neglected for a long time. And I also thought it is perhaps necessary to highlight the divisions that we have always had and that are being revealed now again much more sharply, which is that old north-south divide that we always had on the western side of the east-west divide, where it was the northern countries that had their different interests compared to the Mediterranean countries, and also the east-west divide that we seem to have overcome in 2004 on the 1st of May when 10 new EU member states joined the European Union. But in the meantime, of course, the undercurrents of the developments within the populations, the greater movement, the four freedoms that you also talked about, haven't really been addressed. They have developed further, but the national governments have not necessarily found a way of, or felt it necessary to address these. So it is really important to think about where the decision-making power rests and where the point of reference rests when we're talking about integrative forces and disintegrative forces. And also the fact that we always have two sides of the story, which is the integrative forces at the European Union level, those that believe in the European Union, in a Europe whole, free and united, and those other forces that are actually now seeing the opportunity of exploiting the divisions that have been growing over the past decades and haven't been sufficiently addressed or being paid attention to because there were other issues, such as that wonderful graphic that you showed of all of the many issues that are being discussed in Brussels, that machinery that is developing at the same time and that is developing solutions, but perhaps not solutions that are completely in tune with what the local, regional, national level really needs right now. Because those solutions have not, I would argue, been constructed or developed to face certain challenges that societies as a whole are facing. Neither have they been developed to face the current challenges that we are facing and that have been in the making for a long time. Now, what can be done in Europe at all at a time when we're seeing these disruptive and disintegrative forces? There's often talk of the new German leadership in Europe, that Angela Merkel as a chancellor has the power to reunite or to keep things together. But of course there's also the question of to what extent is it justified to place that responsibility on German shoulders, on the reunified German shoulders, and to what extent Germany today is really able and willing to take on that responsibility. And there are three issues that I think are important to consider. On the one hand, the declaratory commitment that we have in the European Union or in Europe in general to cooperate for the greater good, for mutual benefits. Then the willingness and ability to actually adopt concrete action that is adapted, adjusted, tailored for the problems that we're facing. And finally also, and that's where we really are facing some challenges, the commitment to then also find the resources to invest, to implement that action, those concrete steps, once they have been decided. And I would want to question the extent to which Germany today, under Chancellor Merkel, is able to deliver on a common vision for what Europe should be like, other than whole and free and prosperous and united. In very concrete terms, the declaratory commitment is undoubtedly there. But the concrete steps to address the multiple challenges at different levels of the hierarchy and in different geographic regions and among different groups of society perhaps isn't quite as well developed, because there are so many other issues that have to be dealt with within the political machinery. Then there is also the question of the vigor, the commitment, the driving force of that German motor for European integration, and the willpower and perhaps also the courage of the political leaders. There are four issues that perhaps can quickly illustrate my certain doubts in to what extent Germany, together with others, or even the transatlantic partnership, can just get on with the job and solve all of these many issues that have developed over several decades without being properly addressed. First of all, and that has already been mentioned, on trade, we are now seeing the transatlantic trade and investment partnership challenged, not just by the president-elect and his possible different priorities, but also in Germany at the domestic level. And that is nothing new. It just has been underreported perhaps in the international media, because the German popular opposition to TTIP has been very strong and has now found resonance in Germany at the political level within the coalition, within the Grand Coalition, where the SPD party leader Sigmar Gabriel has now responded to pressures from the base and to what he thinks is what the possible electorate that may be voting for the SPD in the next elections in September next year will want to hear. And that is a much more cautious approach to TTIP. And there Germany as the motor, Germany as the guiding star now in Europe for that transatlantic partnership, is becoming a little bit more shaky than we perhaps otherwise expected. Secondly, and that was also mentioned by the ambassador. On energy, Germany has never actually been the good pupil in the European Union, I would argue. And that goes all the way back to the 1980s and even the 1990s. The first directives for the energy market liberalization in gas and electricity, they were not strongly supported by Germany or France. It was actually more in the interest of the United Kingdom, where we actually have now consequences, concrete, tangible consequences of the Brexit or the looming Brexit, and the fact that the United Kingdom is no longer part of the big three countries that are considered to be the joint motors of European Union cooperation. And on top of that, we have that pesky issue of the Nord Stream pipelines, which is neither a new issue nor an issue that has ever been different at the German national level. In 2005 already, during the previous government of Gerhard Schröder, we had support for the Nord Stream pipeline. The new government, under the Chancellor Merkel, had no opposition to that pipeline. Now we are revisiting an old issue under new circumstances. So what I want to illustrate is just that these are not new issues. These are the same pressures, and these are the same historical developments that are now, under different circumstances, playing out very differently. Two other issues where we can maybe see German role model, or at least it has been perceived as such, which I'm going to quickly qualify again. First of all, which was reported also here in Sweden, the new German civil defense concept placed a lot of emphasis on the societal resilience. So that part of the robustness of the state and societies to deal with any kind of crises, and also the possibility of war. That concept was developed since 2012, now adopted in 2016. So it was not actually a direct response to the developments that we've seen since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. But it has been, I would argue, overstated that the concept embraces also the civil defense, not just the civil protection element, but also the civil defense as part of some sort of total defense, what we're discussing here in Sweden now, under the concept of Totalförsvar. So Germany is aware of these issues and also heavily engaged in the development of responses to these new hybrid threats. But we will have to see to what extent that leadership role will also play out in practice, both within the EU and in NATO, and the cooperation between both. The other issue that has been widely reported, and that is my final point, is that of Germany now all of a sudden announcing that it will invest 2% of its GDP in defense. That, I would argue, has also been a little bit misrepresented in the international debate about it. Because it is by no means Chancellor Merkel who all of a sudden, in response to the Russian threat, sees the light and says, we now have to invest 2%. It has been heavily debated before. There have been pressures from NATO for a long time, for decades, because the last time that Germany actually fulfilled these goals was in the early 1990s. And still in 2014, the defense minister, von der Leyen, who now waves the flag of the 2% that have to be invested, argued that this is absolutely not necessary. 2% of GDP for Germany is so much more than 2% for, let's say, Lithuania. So you should see it in relation to the size of the country and the economic capacity, and it should be by no means an objective. In 2015, she changed her views when she realized the bad state that the Bundeswehr really is in. And the pressures have been there for a long time, and Germany is maybe now stepping up to it. But the question really is whether it will be that vision of what is right and what needs to be done for security, both at the national level and at the European level, and even in the transatlantic partnership, whether it was going to be with vigor, and if there is that courage and willpower behind it, or whether it is just that reluctant motor, that reluctant leader in Europe that maybe can make things work in the absence of the UK, together with France and together with Poland. But we have an election in France coming as well, in addition to the election in Germany. And the relationship with Poland, even within the Weimar Triangle, is not quite as vigorous as we might hope it to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Please sit down and join us for the discussion. Håkan,
Yeah.
if you are wrong, what would be the most important change to the EU if Brexit does happen?
I think the EU will look at itself differently. I mean, the view so far has been that we are a place for making politics for all of Europe. And enlargement after enlargement has reinforced that feeling that the end result will be a unified continent. And with Brexit actually happening, that is no longer a prospect. So I think it will be more a view of itself as a regional and partial cooperation. And that is different. I think it will be very bad for the self-esteem of the European project. But I think to some extent that Mr. Gunnar Lund was right when he wrote in his article in the summer something similar to good riddance. We are much happier without them, always filibustering, always putting the veto card, always stopping necessary development. So there might be, I'm more on the side of Europe being more able to move forward and integrating, especially in the euro area, than I'm on the side of disintegration. But muddling through is still my main scenario, and Britain staying is still very much my main scenario.
Karin, do you agree that the self-image will be the main victim of a Brexit, or are you more on the policy side?
I think that's already happened. I mean, there's been a lot of discussions about, Brexit spreading. I don't think there will be, a chain reaction or anything like that. But obviously, it lowers the threshold for other member states to do the same. And I think, from a pro-market perspective, it's also clear that it has had very strong effects also on the centre-right movement in Europe, which I also think is one of those trends that might play out in the long run and be quite influential. So it has changed the way that I think part of our movement perceives Europe in a way that is important now, given the rise of populism and where the balance of power politically is shifting overall in Europe.
Okay.
Can I just put in one more thing? When I say that it's a real possibility that Brexit will not happen, of course that would be a good thing for Europe, because I think Europe is better and stronger with Britain in it, and Swedish interests are better promoted with Britain at our side for free markets and open societies. But I think it could be quite dangerous also for this perspective that you're mentioning, the feeling that the anti-European sentiment would feel that, well, the Brits tried, but the system is so cleverly designed that it's even impossible to leave. It turned out we were so entangled, and this is because the elite want us to be tied together. So it's almost a stranglehold. You can't ever leave. It's Hotel California all over again. You can check out any time you want, but you can never leave. And that feeling is bad, I think. That feeling would be dangerous, because I'm not a fan of this being the way to keep Britain by this very, very complex legal entanglement that I'm mentioning. I think it's a real possibility that it will happen, but I think it's bad for Europe.
Anke, do you agree?
Well, there will be quite a number of victims of British exit from the European Union, and I think we shouldn't forget either that Britain was quite instrumental in pushing forward the European Union's eastward enlargement, and that Britain has, in contrast to France and Germany, been always a supporter of greater enlargement. So of not drawing a line, of not building a wall or a ring of fire in the east. Because the decisions on both Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova's prospects for EU membership, and also on Turkey, I would argue Britain has been an important counterweight to Paris and Berlin, because it has been the resistance from Germany and from France that was quite instrumental in pushing away Turkey from the European Union at a time when closer ties could have been built and when greater progress could have been made in integrating Turkey. Now, of course, we have the counterfactuals of what would happen today if that progress had been made. What kind of changes would we have seen at the local and national level in Turkey in response to external pressures and other actors? But I think it is really very important not to forget the important role that Britain has always played in that triangle, and that France and Germany have been much more on the same page on a number of issues that are quite crucial for the future of Europe as a whole than Britain, with its special role supporting many of the views that are shared by Sweden and, well, perhaps the whole of the Nordic region, the Netherlands as well, and many of the new member states. So we're losing much more than just that economic part or Britain in the security partnership. It is an important counterweight, and the question right now, why I really wonder what is going to happen in the European Union, with Germany having to shoulder the responsibility for the development of not just the European Union, but also the broader transatlantic partnership, perhaps, since France has always been very critical and to some extent anti-American in its attitude. It rests on Germany's shoulders if Britain is having to take a back seat in the relationships in the different organizations. And there is a spillover effect from the European Union to other areas. Of course, Britain is still stepping up to its commitments in NATO and is an important security partner, but there is a spillover effect because the European Union matters so much on so many levels.
Okay. A question to you, Anke. With the Donald Trump as a president and with the UK leaving EU, do you think there is a prospect in 10 years, 15 years, if those two things happen, that we will have the debate on an EU defense instead of a NATO defense, and that side will win finally?
Well, at least at the political declaratory level, Germany is very much committed to the transatlantic partnership. At the same time, as I tried to indicate, there is very strong reluctance to shoulder any kind of responsibility, any true full responsibility for a European defense relationship. Together with France, yes, but with France, of course, bearing the burden of it as a United Nations Security Council permanent member, and with the nuclear weapons, and just in general the greater profile as a former colonial power, which Germany doesn't have. So I am much more skeptical towards it, and but it highlights that proposal that was now discussed at the Bratislava EU summit on greater defense cooperation and defense union within the framework of the European Union, of course, shows that Germany is trying its best to take more of a leadership role. But there is absolutely no intention to challenge NATO, at least not from the German side. I may be a little bit more skeptical towards the French motivations, given the French track record in NATO. But leaving that aside, we will see.
Is this the beginning, Brexit together with Trump, is this the beginning of a new chapter in the transatlantic relationship, the Anglo-American axis? We had, of course, the special relationship in the 80s with Thatcher and Reagan. We had Clinton and Blair in the 90s. Go back to the 50s. We had the Keynesian policies on both sides of the Atlantic. It looks pretty much like we are in the beginning of something new. And what will that mean in that case? Karin?
Yes, I think it is. And again, from a market or pro-market liberal perspective, and the transatlantic link has always been the very basis. It's been the inspiration. It's been the foundation of the alternative that we have pointed to, and the fact that, I mean, it's not like Western democracy has died this year, but the fact that that international kind of liberalism has really taken quite a hit this year, and I'm not quite sure what's going to come afterwards. But I do still think that it's also important to point out, also in these discussions concerning the European Army or NATO, is that, I mean, we pretty much put ourselves in this position as well. I mean, sooner or later, we would have had an American president saying that, look, I'm just really tired of paying for you guys. And then, you know, we're trying to find a trade deal, and there are demonstrations or people are saying nasty things about the US. So, I mean, sooner or later, I mean, they would get fed up. It happened sooner than what we, you know, would have liked it to. But still, it would have happened anyway. So the question is, what now?
Håkan, I mean, Trump was a supporter of Brexit. True to character, he called it his victory, I remember. And he called it fantastic and so on. And of course offers now very strong support for the British government, inviting Theresa May as, you know, please come join me in this new relationship. Is this bad, good, or both for the British government? Is Donald Trump making Brexit easier or harder?
I'm not sure, and that's a really tough question, and I really would have to think about it. Can I answer another question instead? That I was thinking of, because there's a paradox in this, whether the Western world or there's a new era coming in now. Because I fully agree with Karin when you say that we both have interests in Europe and in the US that are now changing from free trade to towards more of isolationism and protectionism. And the paradox is that while that is bad news for the transatlantic link, the trend is simultaneous on both sides of the Atlantic. So I mean, in cultural terms, it ties us even stronger. The same societal effects are happening on both sides of the Atlantic. That shows how close we are in our mindset, in our political system, in our way outlook of the world. But the machinery that we need to keep this going is at the same time breaking down a little bit if we have less of trade and less of political cooperation. And on the margin, I think Donald Trump is a God gift for the real Brexit part of the back to your question, on the real Brexit part of the British government. But to a person like Theresa May and to the sensible forces in the Conservatives and to other people who will wish for my scenario to manifest itself, of course it's bad news, because the stronger they tie themselves to this mast of leaving, then the more difficult it will be to manage a process wherein, as I predict, in 5 to 10 years' time, you have a stalemate and not so legitimate outcome of the negotiations with the rest of Europe.
Thank you.
And it brings me back to my earlier point that I think we really shouldn't forget. Yes, the European transatlantic relations are very important to consider. What are our lessons from Trump for the European Union or for NATO or for what national governments do with each other? But I think the much more fundamental issue is whether any lessons are being learned for what national governments are doing with the local level within societies, the integration that we have not seen that has been only partially successful in our own societies. And I would, as an example, highlight the German problem, which has perhaps never really been considered a particular German problem since the 1990s, which is the East-West divide that we have. And it's not a simple Cold War divide. It is a divide between societies that have developed side by side, divided by a wall, a real physical wall, in different political systems, fundamentally different political systems and environments. And I don't think that enough has been done to take that problem seriously. The discussions that we had in Germany in the 1990s were more about redistributing wealth, redistributing social welfare programs that had been developed over the last decade since the Second World War in the western part of Germany. But we have massive differences also within societies of what different groups of society expect from the national government and what the local or federal parts are now giving them as responses, because even in the political sphere we have massive differences between East Germany and West Germany and who votes for what and what kind of political parties we see
in the local governments, if you can call the Bundesländer governments that. And I think, I mean, even in Sweden, the debates that we have about the Sweden Democrats and the debates that we have in France now about do we have a Le Pen as the next president, and what effects that will have on the European Union. I think the real question is, are national governments learning the lessons for what they have to do within the country and how they address these issues that will ensure the robustness of the state and the societal resilience, the integration between the different groups. Because
Karin,
that's sort of the basis for everything else.
does what Anke says now, does that relate to your critique earlier on the European Commission and how they react to Brexit and the social agenda and so on?
Yes, in a way it does. I mean, I don't question the sort of the motives behind this push. I mean, I think I just think the analysis is wrong. They say that, okay, we're picking up the fact that people are now very displeased with there being foreign workers here. We're picking up the fact that there is competition between jobs, that we have a populist wave. So what we do is that we try to redistribute some more and ensure that we do have an intracircular migration where we do not discriminate. And I think, I mean, and obviously that's a very sound basis for a policy. It's just the problem is that I think it will only worsen the problem because it will just tighten the fight over resources.
But are you against it because it's too centralistic or because it's too much left policy?
Both. They go hand in hand. And no, so I think that's really going to be it's daft, to be honest, to think that what the European citizens right now are begging for is having more centralization over the most sensitive policy areas there are, which is welfare and social security.
What's your view on this, Håkan?
I would agree, and I think that it would be a big mistake if we have the EU opening new chapters of policy that have to do with taxation and social insurance schemes, because that is a so big difference between the nations, and it's so little gain by having it centralized. But there are other parts of the social agenda that I think the EU could usefully do more on, but that's another story.
Short, and then I'll open the floor.
In many ways, there's, I would argue, a projection of the disgruntlement that I try to describe at the national level onto the European Union or even the transatlantic partnership. And that projection of everything that is wrong in people's lives, and that has to do with the fact that that feedback loop between the local and the national level hasn't been working so well, and that the developments, that those parallel political processes have not been going hand in hand. That there's a lot of problems that have not been sufficiently addressed at the national level, whereas integration has progressed very quickly at the European Union level. And that disjuncture, I think, is the real problem, because as many analyses have also argued, well, whether Trump won because of Trump or whether Trump won because of that disgruntlement of the issues that people were struggling with, and the same with the Brexit, or the same also with the Dutch referendum, and also the rise of the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, in Germany, and with Le Pen, and in many other countries, or even in Hungary and in Poland. It is general issues that are then projected onto certain political parties and leaders that seem to offer easy solutions. But and in the same way, you could say that the European Union perhaps is trying to deliver solutions top down now that are disjointed from the actual developments on the ground in the member states.
Thank you. Now it's the time for you to put questions to the panel. And the first question is over there.
Niklas Rosback at the Swedish Defence Research Agency. I have two questions, more specifically about the security consequences of Brexit. Should we in Sweden be concerned that the UK, which is now ramping up its commitment to Baltic security, will actually leave once the negotiations to leave the EU are over? I do know that the NATO and the EU are two different things, but they want to play good European as long as they're trying to get out of the EU. Is there a risk of the British commitment to the Baltic ticking? Is the clock ticking on that? The other question I have, once the British have left, Europe is losing a great deal of its ability to deploy overseas. Britain will have 2 aircraft carriers coming upstream. in a few years' time. But what does the EU have? Will there be any credibility of the common security and defense policy in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to answer?
We have put all our money into the vård, skola, omsorg instead, so we can't afford any aircraft carriers. No, but honestly, I think there is without being an expert on this, but if you listen to the tonality of the Brexit debate and of the new British government, with Britain first being and very much a British flag, there is a risk that that will influence also their view on NATO and the commitments beyond Britain's borders. Yes.
Yes. Well, it will have an effect on Britain, of course, but Britain is and always has been a naval nation. Nothing will change that. And so in that sense, the Baltic Sea and that geographic region will always stay relevant for the United Kingdom in the broader Northern European context. So I wouldn't doubt that British commitment to NATO and to security in Northern Europe, because there's also financial interests when it comes down to it. Because Britain has been very much engaged in Central and Eastern Europe with investments, especially in the Baltic states, since the very first beginning, which is often also forgotten. And although Britain is not a member of the Council of the Baltic Sea States in any way, there is a clear commitment behind the scenes. On the other hand, of course, it is going to have a tangible impact if Brexit happens, or even already now, because it has an impact on Britain's resources. And of course, the resource availability will have serious consequences for what Britain is able to do in terms of defense, even if priorities are being changed at the national level, but in particular in the wake of the Brexit referendum and the popular discontent in many parts of the United Kingdom, there is a question of where the priorities will go, and I'm sure more of a national commitment will follow. But yeah, available resources, I think, is the main factor there.
Next question here. Yes.
Henrik Salander, Swedish Academy of War Sciences. My question is to Håkan Jonsson personally. I agree with you that Brexit will probably not happen, but I wanted to comment upon a couple of other things on that road that may complicate things even further. First is that Theresa May will have to call parliamentary election quite soon, latest 2020. And the second is that there will be a new Labour leader sooner or later, who will have to be remain. So how do you see that play on?
This is more of British politics than of EU politics, and there are people in this room far better suited than I to respond to that. But under any circumstances, a election battle between the Conservatives and Labour in the coming year will be won fair and square by the Conservatives. But it might be that Jeremy Corbyn is in the same vein as Donald Trump and Brexit itself, the symptom rather than the cause. And that his way of doing politics on the left side is going to be winning in 5 to 10 years' time. And that may come into play, a populist left streak that we'll see with Mr. Corbyn. And I'm a bit curious if I can put that question to the other experts on the panel. We are discussing now the threat of a right-wing populism all over Europe, and we must be vigilant, of course. But isn't there also in several countries a risk of a left-wing extreme populism coming up, especially in, paradoxically, older Soviet and Union states and Soviet Union states under communism? So my response to you is yes, this may come into play. It will complicate things. It will not change the fundamentals of what I mentioned here, which options are really there realistically and legally on the table. But it might change how this is discussed and how this is being debated and which solution to find for it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Johnson, Swedish Parliament. Question to Anke on defense integration. Why do the EU or the Europeans fall into the fallacy the whole time of engaging into self-defeating behavior when it comes to talking about European defense. Obviously, the CSDP needs revamping. It's stuck in the 90s with the Petersburg Task and the headline goals. But as soon as we start discussing this, we talk about European army, about the ill-defined security and defense union, and also things as increased strategic autonomy for the EU, which I think is a malplaced idea. Rather than focusing on the obvious, which is the nexus between internal and external security, where the EU really can make a difference in combining its resources on terrorism and crisis management and so forth. Thank you.
Well, of course, that's one reading of saying that it's self-defeating behavior of the European Union and that they always get it wrong. But, well, I tried to at least sketch out some of the issues, which is that French-German couple on the one hand and the British interests, and perhaps also Poland as one representative of the Visegrad or some of the Central East European interests and concerns. In that context, you could say that there is no intrinsic contradiction between a stronger European defense union and NATO. There doesn't have to be. In nice EU speak, synergies and added values could be had there if it was done to such an extent that there are no physical overlaps and no political quarrels between the two organizations, and no fundamental differences of opinion within the organizations between the member states. But I think it comes back down to what I said earlier about, on the one hand, the declaratory commitment has always been there that Europe should stand on its own feet, that the European Union member states should invest and cooperate more closely on security and defense for the European Union to really truly become an international actor. And then concrete action has been taken to some extent. With the headline goals, there are some decisions that could have been implemented perhaps differently, and the defense union is all laudable objectives in many ways.
But you must agree that there can only be one place where you have the core, the mutual defense assurances. There can only be one spot for that.
The European Union is, in that sense, a complement, not a substitution to NATO. And it comes back down to the third issue that is really the crux of the problem, which is the willingness to invest the resources, to put the money where the mouth is, and to then actually implement the actions. So there's no shortage of good ideas that could fly and actually be a good, strong complement within the European Union. So it's not per se a problem that the European Union defense cooperation should be strengthened, but not at the expense, of course, of NATO, and not as a plaster to just try and gloss over the fact that there are so many much more fundamental issues that haven't been addressed. And again, we are at that issue of the real issues are not tackled, while there are a lot of lofty ambitions that are then not being followed through substantially. But I wouldn't see that that's just self-defeating behavior. The self-defeating behavior is just at the last step of action is agreed, and then the investment is lacking and the courage and commitment is lacking. So it's not really getting followed through in a principled manner.
Did we have any more questions from the audience? Or do I have the pleasure to put the last question myself? Yes, I do. All of you seem to be a bit skeptical about the spread of Brexit. But, you know, we had the vote in Britain, it did happen, Trump did happen. We have elections coming up now in Netherlands in March, in France in May.
Germany in September.
If Marine Le Pen becomes president of France, will we still sit here, have these surprise discussions? How could all of us be so wrong? How could the voters be so wrong?
Yes.
Or, yes.
We will.
And what lessons should we learn from that?
I think in many ways it's hopeful that we remain hopeful, but that we don't want to give up on the idea that we've lived in a pretty good world, now turning sour. I think the moment when we stop having these conversations is when we give up, and we can't give up. I think it's quite the contrary, actually. Now is the time when we need to not only sit here and moan about it, but actually get real about other options.
I kind of like what the ambassador said this morning, that we should act, we should do more things, we should think of smart things, actions, visible, tangible things to do, to show what a free and liberal world is like. And I think we've been talking too much. It's been too much discussion in the last few years on identities and on values. I like values, I promote them all the time, but I think we should be more practical and do things, do stuff. And I'm not, this is the way how I escape from your question of Brexit spreading or not. Even if Marine Le Pen wins in the French presidential elections and will start a Brexit procedure or a Frexit procedure after that, however she would manage to do that in her country, that would not be Brexit spreading to France. That would again be Brexit and Marine Le Pen being symptoms of the deeper root cause of an illness in our society that we are not really managing the discussion at the moment.
I will disagree with you on the values and ideals and identity issues, because I think there is no contradiction between what you're saying and what your ambition is. If you're saying, well, we should really not be focusing on the values and identity, I think that is what politicians will actually have to focus on more. They will have to focus on the national level, getting their own house in order, both at the local level, at the regional level, and at the national level, and then also address the issues jointly that have to be addressed in the larger groups within Europe and within the transatlantic community. Because it's the lack of that joint identity or an understanding of the fundamental values that we are now facing at the most fundamental level, why we are seeing the Le Pens and Trump, and why we're also seeing the AFD or perhaps the Sweden Democrats or the UKIP. It is that disconnect with the people's personal understanding of the situation. And unless you can actually create the joint commitment to these common values, the good things in Europe, the value of the transatlantic community, you cannot really combat that with concrete action. The concrete action starts at the national level, I would argue. And then all of what can be done jointly, better than alone, which everyone understands, that can then tackle all of the remaining external and domestic challenges. But domestic challenges have to be faced by the national governments. That's their responsibility. That's the feedback loop directly between the electorate and decision makers.
Let's end on that note of disagreement. I think it's a good ending point. And let's now follow the advice of the ambassador. Let's quit talking and acting and go drink coffee instead. Thank you very much for listening.